Welcome, everyone. Thanks for taking the time to join us this evening. We'd like to say a special thank you to Alderman Goonan and Alderman Morgan for joining us. Their presence is greatly appreciated. My name is Melissa Oliveira Dennis. My husband and I live in the area, and our daughter attends St. Catherine of Siena School. I'd like to introduce two other parents who have been instrumental in our efforts thus far, and that's Stacy Donovan, who we are grateful to for bringing the small cell to our attention and posting it in our school Facebook page. Kelly Norton has also been a great support behind the scenes with assistance and coordination. I don't know if you ladies can wave to say hi to everybody so they know who you are if they need to reach out to you. We'd also like to thank the many parents and neighbors who've helped share information with others in the community. Lastly, I would like to introduce Pam Wallace, who is a colleague of Dr. Chamberlain's, as she'll be our moderator this evening. For some of us, this all started as a Facebook post in our parents group for St. Catherine's. It was regarding a single tower in close proximity to the building and playground, but it didn't take long for us to realize that these towers are actually in several locations around the area. And this impacts our community, our students, and our neighbors. So many of us are here to learn more because of our children. We're here to learn more about the towers, how they impact them while they are at school, while others are here as parents and parents and residents who are impacted. There are parents that also live near the school. Since interests extend beyond St. Catherine's, we needed a forum where everyone impacted would have an opportunity to learn, ask questions, and move forward. That being said, since the issue still involves the school, we have and continue to involve the school administration, offering them to lead or join us. That's all we can do is extend invitations to join the conversation and join efforts. We recognize strength in numbers and keeping everyone on the same page by advancing our efforts. Those are our only initiatives here tonight and within the Facebook group. In that spirit, we recognize the immediate need for conversation and to continue without further delay. Since we all have unanswered questions, we're looking where to turn, and we're wondering who we can rely on for support and resources. I think we can agree that if we work together and use our collective knowledge and resources, we can accomplish a lot. So our goals for this evening are to, number one, just learn some more about what these towers are and what their implications are for us. And then number two, if you haven't already, we ask that you join and connect with us on our Facebook group. That's where you can check back for more updates, future meetings, progress, and additional education. The group is called Manchester, New Hampshire, Ward 1 and 2 Small Cell Towers in our neighborhood, and SES. We'll include the link in the chat, so you can just click on that and then join. Our third step here, our third goal, is to determine everyone's level of interest going forward. We ask that you reach out to us via Messenger in the Facebook group. We're eager to begin working on some action plans, and we would like to assess who would like to be directly involved and who would like to remain updated on our progress. So again, we just ask that you go on, let us know what your thoughts are, and then we will be letting you know when we'll be planning on meeting going forward. So now we'd like to introduce our presenter for this evening. Dr. Chamberlain is the past chair and professor emeritus in the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering at the University of New Hampshire. In his more than 40 years in academia, he has performed research for over 25 sponsors, including the National Science Foundation. He has received 2 Fulbright Awards, including the prestigious Fulbright Distinguished Chair. He has also served as the associate editor for the Institute for Electrical and Electronics Engineers, and he regularly performs reviews for them and other technical and scientific publications. Dr. Chamberlain served on the New Hampshire State Commission that was convened through legislation to explore the impacts of wireless radiation. Since serving on the commission, he has been active in carrying out the recommendations of the commission by working with legislators and community groups around the world. Dr. Chamberlain is a founding member of the International Commission on Biological Effects of Electromagnetic Fields, which is an international group of renowned scientists with expertise in radiation and biological effects. And he is the president of the Environmental Health Trust. Last summer, he engaged in a speaking tour in Europe, where he presented the findings of the New Hampshire Commission to groups that included the Royal Society of Medicine in London. It is notable that he is the chair of a local school board and is aware of the realities and responsibilities of managing a school. We would like to welcome Dr. Kent Chamberlain. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction, Melissa, and thank you all for being here this evening. In Melissa's introduction, you heard about my professional background, but it's important that you understand my motivation for giving this presentation. I am not getting paid to speak to you this evening. I have no vested interest whatsoever in whether cell phone radiation is harmful, and it's noteworthy that I didn't even think that it was a problem before joining the New Hampshire Commission. As I'll explain in my presentation, that commission was tasked with answering questions about the harms of wireless radiation, and I learned important information that relates to your health and the health of your children. For reasons that will become clear in my presentation, this important information is not being publicized, just as the harms of smoking weren't publicized decades ago. The slides will be made available. I'll give it to Melissa, and I'm assuming that you can get them to people, Melissa. And I should note that there are hyperlinks in the slides. So if I say something, and I'll be pointing this out in my presentation, you can find out the source of that information by simply clicking on the hyperlink. Now, there is kind of a bad news, good news thing in my presentation. Bad news, I think you already know the answer, and that is wireless radiation is harmful. And I'll show you just how harmful it is, and I'll give you some perspective about that harm. But the very good news, and I'm saying this as somebody who's studied electromagnetics, who's designed radios and antennas my entire career, the good news is there's a lot we can do about it. I do not want to give up my cell phone, and you don't have to. And it's what we can do, but we simply have to acknowledge that there's a problem there. So once industry is willing to acknowledge the problem of wireless radiation, there is so much that we can do so that we can continue to enjoy the convenience of our smartphones and our smart devices without exposing ourselves to unnecessary health problems. So right now I'm going to go into share slides with you. And this is always a little bit problematic, right? So if you will bear with me just a second, I'll share my slides. And I'm assuming you can see my slides right now. I'm looking for a thumbs up. If you can see my slides, oop, I got a thumbs up, which is what I was looking for. So, well, first of all, I want to let you know what I'm covering in this presentation. And first thing is just answers about the harms of wireless radiation. And that's why most of you are here. Yeah, there's a tower outside my kid's bedroom. How worried should I be? And I'll give you pretty clear answers on how worried that you should be. And to get there, I need to talk about the commission. Why was the commission formed? Who was on it? What did we use to draw our conclusions? So you need to know that. And this is important for you to have credibility or have a belief in what it is that we came up with, so it's credible to you. How the wireless radiation guidelines were set. As you hear people from industry talk this, they'll say, oh, you're only 0.1% of the FCC limit, so you're good to go. And that's not true. And I'll show you why I'm making that statement about it not being true. And so something else that really struck us on the commission is what's the role of government bodies in protecting us? The FCC, Federal Communications Commission. What's their role? And I'll answer that as well. Security issues. This is important because sometimes people will be told around schools that you need to have these cell towers for communications in emergency situations, and it's really not the case. And then finally, we'll end up with questions and answers, so you can pose questions to me that maybe I didn't cover or that I did cover that you'd like to have greater detail on. Or perhaps you'd like to ask something totally, off the wall that relates to wireless communication. So first thing, the New Hampshire Commission on the Health Effects of 5G and Wireless Technology. The reason it was formed is that legislators, and legislators have a lot to do. They have sometimes thousands of bills to act on during a legislative cycle. So they didn't have time to delve into this themselves when they were asked or when they were told by their constituents is that wireless radiation was harming them. And they had the scientific evidence to back it up. Yet these same legislators were hearing from industry is, totally harmless, and you need to put more facilities in your state to be competitive, to remain competitive. So what these legislators did is they formed a commission, and it takes, you have to write a bill, you have to get it passed by both houses of the legislature, and it has to be signed by the governor. So if you want to see what that looks like, what the legislation looks like that formed the commission, you can click on this link here. So we ended up with 13 commission members. As you can see on the slide, we had backgrounds that included medicine, we had 2 medical doctors, physics, toxicology, electromagnetics, epidemiology, biostatistics, occupational health, the list goes on. So we really had the experts in our commission to answer questions that were being posed to us. And so what were those questions? Well, the first one is if wireless radiation is harmless, then why won't insurance companies insure against it? And they won't, not even Lloyd's of London. So the insurance industry recognizes it as a risk, but they won't insure against it because, well, because they know what a risk it is. We were also asked why many hundreds and actually probably thousands of peer-reviewed publications show harm from wireless radiation, but they're completely ignored by the Federal Communications Commission. Also, the FCC, and I'm going to go back to this later on, the FCC in setting its guidelines say that the only harm that you will get from wireless radiation is if it warms you up. I think you all know that wireless radiation or electromagnetic radiation can warm things up. That's what your microwave oven is all about. But what the FCC is claiming is that if it doesn't warm you up sufficiently to cause damage, then it's not a threat at all. And that's the short-term acute risk that they're saying is the only risk. And why did the World Health Organization classify wireless radiation as a Class B carcinogen? It's probable considered carcinogen. And that also is being just completely ignored by the Federal Communications Commission. So these were some of the issues that were posed to us and some of the questions that we were asked to answer. So I'm going to get into sorry for rearranging my slides here a little bit. So what we did, and I'm not going to go into excruciating detail about the commission and how we worked, but we did meet for over a year and we had the experts that I mentioned in the last slide. It's also important to point out that we weren't getting paid to serve on the commission, and that's why I'm calling it an unbiased commission. So some of the information we got was from peer-reviewed publications. Now notice that I say it's peer-reviewed and commission vetted. I'm just acknowledging that not all peer-reviewed journal articles are true, are accurate, or contain the right information. And so what we did is we picked out articles that looked really relevant, and then we did a study of it. We vetted them to make sure that the publications that we used in drawing our conclusions were credible. And I can guarantee that's the case. And like I say, I don't want to go into too much detail, but I've done a lot of peer reviewing or vetting of publications in my career as a department chair at the university and serving as a chair of a commission of a promotion and tenure committee. And so and also serving as an associate editor for IEEE. So I'm familiar with how to determine if the article you're looking at is credible. And I can guarantee that the ones that we used to draw our conclusions were peer reviewed, were credible. So we also invited regulatory agencies. The FCC is the Federal Communications Commission, FDA, Food and Drug Administration, EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, and these 3 agencies are involved in setting standards for wireless radiation. So we invited them to come to our commission. Remember, it was a formal state commission. We invited them to come meet with us to explain things about exposure limits and all that. But in the final analysis, nobody showed up from any of those commissions. And so, and we tried interacting with them via email and phone calls, and they never answered our questions. So at this point, sometimes I get stopped in this presentation. People say, well, why did you list the regulatory agencies as your sources of information when they never showed up? Well, the fact that they didn't show up is important information, and it comes into play later on in this presentation. We also brought in outside experts. We brought in 9, and 8 of those presenters defined clear harms of wireless radiation. And the one that didn't, the one that said that wireless radiation is totally harmless, is the one presenter who was paid to be there by industry. And it was also the only paid experts. Everybody else came on a volunteer basis. But the one guy that was paid to come speak with us said, well, wireless radiation is harmless. And I got to say that in my 4 years since the commission, the only people I've heard claim that wireless radiation is harmless are those who are affiliated with the telecommunications industry. So again, without going into great detail, I'm going to tell you what the outcome is of the peer review. And that is we identified hundreds of top tier publications that showed harm from low-level wireless radiation. Well, that's meaningful. Top tier, were the people who wrote the articles from name brand universities and wouldn't want to jeopardize their career by putting out false information. And the publications themselves were highly rated. So they showed, many of them showed that there was a problem with exposure to radiation. And the vast majority, it wasn't like there were only a small percentage of articles that showed harm. The vast majority of them showed harm from wireless radiation. In particular, 91% of the articles that looked into free radicals, that is oxidative damage, showed that there was harm. And so it's not like you're getting only a small percentage, as I mentioned. So the reason I bring these first two bullet points up is that I have heard people from industry make the claim that the only articles that show harm from wireless radiation are those that are cherry-picked from fringe journals. And these two bullets show that that is absolutely not the case. They're not from fringe journals at all. They're from top-tier publications, and they're not in the minority. We didn't have to do any cherry picking at all because they were in the majority. This bit about free radicals is important. I think that most people have heard the term free radicals, and it relates to oxidative stress. And we can go into detail about that if anybody has questions about that later on. But a lot of us do things and take supplements, for example, eat the foods to lower our free radicals in our system because we know that free radicals lead to oxidative stress, lead to inflammation, which can lead to a host of diseases, which I'll talk about on the next slide. And just a note here, the International Agency for Research on Cancer has identified oxidative stress can lead to cancer, putting it in shorthand notation. So what happens? What diseases are associated with this oxidative stress, these free radicals? Well, here they are. And for every one of these that is shown on the slide, for every one of the diseases, there's a link that just is one example of an article that shows an association, let's say, for sperm damage, infertility, and the problem itself. So, what causes it? So you could click on one of these links and you are brought to the article that describes it. As an example, you can take a sample of sperm, semen, and put it into 2 test tubes and expose one to radiation and not expose the other to radiation. And there's a demonstrable difference in the motility and health of the sperm. And so it's, not like, and some of these articles talk about that. So if you go down the list, neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's, cancer, oxidative diabetes, and this is just a short list. And I only have one link to each of these diseases, but you can find many more. So here is the view from 40,000 feet where you can say, well, in the laboratory, we've shown an association between these diseases and exposure to wireless radiation. What's the big picture here? Well, here's something for you to consider. Here is the Alzheimer's rate for Alzheimer's death, the Alzheimer's death rate from 2000 to 2020. Now you can see here on the chart that the death rate from Alzheimer's has more than doubled in that period of time. I'm not saying that is definitely caused by exposure to wireless radiation, but it certainly is associated with it. Laboratory studies have shown that there is that association. And then when you look at the overall incidence rate for that disease, well, it's clearly they track pretty well with radiation exposure, which I'll talk more about in a second. Something else that was on that previous list, and that is diabetes. And by the way, I'm getting these data, and I'll go back here. If you click on the link, and you can see that this is one from the Alzheimer's Association. That's where I'm getting it. So it's not like from some right-wing or left-wing conspiracy theory, website. No, this is just, from readily available information on the internet. The other one is for the diabetes. And it's really kind of striking. You go back to 2004 and you see, yeah, I mean, you did have rates of diabetes, but not nearly what you're seeing in 2012 and 2019. Well, what happened between 2004 and 2019? And in particular, what happened in 2007? It's the smartphone came out. And again, I'm not saying that, the wireless radiation exposure is the cause, but certainly there's a lot of evidence suggests that it is a cause. So let's look at the radiation rates in this country between the same dates that I showed for the last on the last slide, 2004. Yeah, there were a lot of networks out there, wireless networks, and it's we had to hire to work to find a signal in those days. And then 2008, my gosh, there was a big jump in exposures. And then 2012, whoa, it's but then finally 2019, you can't escape signals. It's really a huge amount. So I'll let you draw your own conclusions about this kind of overview, this 40 view from 40,000 feet. We have diseases that are associated with wireless radiation exposure. And then when you look at those diseases over time, they've been increasing, and then they seem to be increasing along with radiation exposure. So I don't mean to be an alarmist, but I do want to bring this to your attention because it's serious. And I'll leave it at that. So that's the view from 40,000 feet. Let's get closer to the ground and look at exposures, really practical situations that you may be able to identify with. So this happened back in 2004. And so the question is, what do we know about the placement of cell towers on buildings? In this particular example, those buildings were fire stations. Somebody thought it'd be a great idea to put antennas on or near those stations, and it really does, from an engineering standpoint, make sense. Utilities are available. You already have the structures in place in many instances. So let's put those antennas there and see what happens. I mean, actually, they weren't doing it as to see what happens. They just did it because it was expedient. So they mounted these on, and the question is now what happened after they turned the towers on? And I'll read this to you. It's, within a week of installation, when they turned them on, many firefighters developed unusual symptoms of headaches, fatigue, insomnia, memory loss, confusion, nausea, and weakness. After a time, firefighters in stations with adjacent cell towers were found to have forgotten CPR or became lost responding to a fire in a city they grew up in. This is not, just a one-off. This happened in pretty much all of the fire stations where they put the towers in. In some fire stations, like the first one, it was every firefighter in that station that experienced these symptoms. And it was after they turned the fire tower on, or turned the cell towers on. And so you can read more about this. It's in Physicians for Safe Technology, but the information is available, but it's not widely publicized for reasons that, in fact, maybe I can say it right now. You'd think that something like this would be front page news, but it's not, because after all, who owns or who are some of the major advertisers for news outlets? Telecom. And actually, who owns some of the news outlets? Many of them, actually. The same companies that own telecom. So this clearly isn't good for telecom. People would have a different relationship with their cell phones if they knew this to be the case. So the telecoms, are making efforts that are kind of startling to keep people from knowing the truth about wireless radiation exposure. Maybe that's why you hadn't heard about the New Hampshire Commission, or many of you hadn't heard it. So one thing also you should know is the firefighters, through their union, put in provisions so that cell towers are now no longer being placed on or near the fire stations. I kind of like this, or feel like this is an important example, because when we think of firefighters, we think of people who are robust physically and are probably the least likely to complain. And that's the case. That is who these people are. So when you have them telling you that this wireless radiation is making them sick, well, it's worth paying attention to. Very briefly, I'll say that in the laboratory you can duplicate these findings. You expose people to radiation, and they start developing the symptoms not dissimilar to what was experienced by the firefighters. So again, we've looked at the view from 40,000 feet. We've looked at this in a smaller example, and I'd like you to look at something else, which is very important when it comes to answering questions about living near a cell tower. And this is a study back in Brazil, and there are a couple of reasons why I think it's a very important study to look at. It happened between 1996 and 2006. So it was for a long time ago, but there's some good aspects to that. There are reasons that that makes the study more important, the fact that it was done a while back. And what it looks like, oh, and you can look at the article if you want to read it yourself, but what it explored was the relationship between death by cancer, so the death rate by cancer, and the distance that people lived from a cell tower. And so, and this is a key important bullet, and they didn't look at a small number of people, but they looked at thousands of people. They looked at over 7,000 deaths by cancer and a large number of cell towers, over 800. So when you're doing studies of this type that involve statistics, you want a large N, a large number of people and a large number of things that you look at. And that's what they did in this case. Now, as I mentioned, this was happened between 1996 and 2006. And during that time, a lot of people, in fact, only fewer, well fewer than a quarter of the people had their own cell phones. So what we're looking at here is the exposure to the cell tower as opposed to people's exposure to their own devices. So that's, like I say, one reason I consider it to be pretty important. So what we were only looking at was the effect of living near a tower. It's important to note that the maximum exposure level was only 5% of the FCC limit, only 5%. And yet you'll see what the outcome of that study is. And the outcome of that study is shown in a single slide. And here it is. You have here is the blue line, first of all, and that is the rate of mortality per 10,000 people for the population in general. What you have in red is the trace for people living within a kilometer of the cell tower. So notice that as we're moving along the x-axis, these are for people living that distance from the cell tower, and you can see a monotonic decline. That as you get closer and closer to the cell tower, the death rate by cancer has increased. And so as you get farther and farther away, finally it merges with asymptotes to the cancer rate for the population in general. And this is kind of a test. Of course, you'd expect that. So monotonic decline, a dose-dependent relationship, and the fact that it meets the cancer rate for the population in general when you get far enough away. Now, the New Hampshire Commission said that 500 meters is a reasonable setback distance for towers. This is in part where we got that number from. Although I'll show you on the next slide that a lot of other people have looked at this and they've come to similar conclusions. So that if you live 500 meters or more away from a cell tower, well, your incidence of cancer, your likelihood of death by cancer becomes that of the population in general, the unexposed population. So this wasn't the only study that looked at that. There are what are called meta studies. And so with a meta study, that just means that you're looking at all, previous studies that have looked at pretty much the same thing as what you want to find out about. So there were 38 previous studies, and they combined them all together to find out about the effects of living near a cell tower. And the vast majority, showed, sickness, radiofrequency sickness, increased cancer, changes in other biological parameters. Interesting, they show that a negative impact for animals and trees around cell towers. And I can only say a little bit about that, but that is an impact. It has a very negative impact on birds, bees, trees, and all that. And if it has an effect like that on birds, bees, and trees, think of what is happening to us. But something that did come out a number of times in the meta studies is if you're 500 meters away from a cell tower, that's a reasonable cutoff distance. Okay. this point in the New Hampshire Commission, we realized that, there's a problem. The people are getting harmed by the radiation. We kind of understood it clearly at that point. How were the FCC radiation standards set? Well, those limits were set in the 1980s, and they were based on, get this, short-term exposures, around an hour. And these, by the way, so the standards that were set in these studies are the standards that are in use today for 24/7, 365 exposures. But because they were only assuming that it was temperature, the heating effects that were of harm, that kind of made sense to them. But here are the studies that were performed. So back in the 1980s again, 8 rats, 5 monkeys. Now they've done other studies since then with more animals, but they came to the same conclusions. So I can realistically say that they are basing the standards that you're being exposed to today, the standards that people talk about when they say, oh, it's only a certain percentage of the FCC limits. This is what they're talking about. And so the way the study was performed, they had trained these animals to push a lever to get food. They were food deprived at the beginning of the experiment. And during the experiment, the researchers kept turning up the power, turning up the power, turning up the power until the animals, through heat stress, could no longer perform the function of pushing the lever to get more food, even though they were still hungry. So that's why it's called a behavioral study. So how much radiation can you expose an animal to before they cannot function? Well, they found that number. And by the way, I should mention that some of the monkeys had burns on their faces at that point. So they called that high level exposure where the animals no longer function. They called that the threshold dose. And then they applied a totally arbitrary safety, what they call a safety factor, and of 50. They said, in other words, we take that very high radiation exposure, divide it by 50, and that's what we're going to say is safe for the population in general. And I know here that if you're a worker working around these devices, then it's only a safety factor of 10. So at this point, every time I go through this, I still can't believe it. It just represents such bad sciences. So I'm doing a recap here, in case you saw this and you're still stunned. Like I still get stunned when I read this. The FCC radiation guidelines currently for use for lifetime exposures are based on studies lasting an hour or less. Amazing. A single endpoint. Now, for anybody familiar with epidemiology or clinical studies or experimental studies like this, animal behavior studies, know that you don't have a single endpoint. That is the point at which the animal could no longer push the lever to get food. I mean, you look at lots of things, cortisol levels, temperatures at various parts of the body. You don't just leave it with one single endpoint. And then a small sampling. I mean, as you heard in the Brazilian study, they were dealing with thousands of situations, thousands of subjects. In this case, they had 8 rats and 5 monkeys. What can you tell there? An arbitrary safety factor. I mean, you usually look for a certain, you're shooting for a particular target in terms of relative risk when you do a study like this. In other words, if you apply a safety factor of X or Y, you'll have a certain relative risk. Nothing like that. They have no idea what the relative risk is for this, particularly in the long term. It's somewhat similar to asking us to smoke a pack of cigarettes in an hour. And if you live to tell about it, well, that shows that smoking is safe. Well, I'll leave that to you. One point I want to make here is why I'm, screaming about this, being, lasting an hour or less, and how that's totally inappropriate to tell about the real risk. And that's by looking at some trees. Now, what's going on in the slide is we have a mast on the very left, and then 465 feet away from it, we have a tree. And in 2008, that tree looks pretty healthy. But then you go 7 years later and the tree's not looking so happy. And it's the side that's being exposed that is looking less healthy over time. And then finally, you go another 4 years and you can see the tree is really looking sad. And finally, they had to cut it down. Now, this is not a single example. They looked at well over 100 trees. Some trees are more susceptible to radiation than others. But as you can see in this one, when you expose it for long enough a time, then you're going to have deleterious effects on its health. One thing I want to point out here is what I'm circling in red here is that the left side of the tree is only exposed to, well, let's call it the 3,380 microwatts. That's less than what you're seeing in your parking lot. And that's only 0.03% of the FCC limit. So the point here is you expose something for a long time to low-level radiation, it has a negative impact. So that just gives you a sense of the time. And this is a very interesting study that I understand is being continued. So, okay, how do our limits compare to, well, other countries? Well, you can see here that we kind of have the highest radiation exposure levels. This is then 10 right here. Can you see my cursor? Okay, so this is 10 watts per meter squared, which is 10 million microwatts per meter squared. So we keep those levels very high. And then in other countries, well, it's a lot more reasonable, although Italy is getting pressure put on it to raise its limits. And I can say just briefly right now, why industry likes those high limits. Well, the reason is that it allows them to put an antenna right in the middle of where people live, radiate a lot of power, and so they get a great coverage area, but they're really overexposing people living near the antenna. And that causes bad effects. So to come up with more reasonable exposures, people would still get very good cell phone reception. But if they also wouldn't be overly exposed, and I'll say more about that quantitatively in a moment. So here's, what signal level do you need to have a robust phone call? Well, this is a tower that you may be familiar with. It's isn't it? And yeah, correct me if I'm wrong, Melissa, but this is the one that you pointed out that is near the parking lot. And if you take a meter out and you put it near there, you can read, and this reads in microwatts per meter squared, that you're getting a pretty healthy dose of radiation exposure. And so notice here that this meter is indicating that that is extreme radiation, and indeed it is. That this can have a very negative impact if somebody is exposed to this type of radiation for a long period of time, even though it's clearly within the FCC limits. But I think you can see now that those limits are meaningless, particularly in the long term. So that's what you're seeing. But the question is, okay, what do I need in terms of signal level to have a robust phone call? And I think you might be surprised by this. So a great signal, 4 to 5 bars, is only, I'm going to put this up. So to get the 5 bars, you need the 6 microwatts per meter squared, and that would register on this meter right here. But a 4-bar signal, you get robust communication, that would be it wouldn't even show up on this meter right here. It's a millionth of the FCC limit. Okay, what if you can get by with 3 to 4 bars? What do you need there? Well, none of these would show up. Notice these are nanowatts, which is 1/1000th of a microwatt. So in other words, you can get a very good signal with or a very good robust phone call with something that wouldn't even show up on this meter. Obviously would be very safe. It would be in the green light right here. So my point oh, and I also want to mention my own phone. I can do download videos. I can go onto YouTube with 2 bars and do just fine. So it's not like you need to have a cell tower in your front yard to get robust communication. Not at all. A very tiny and what I would consider to be a safe signal could be at levels that, would give you a robust signal or, robust call, but it would be in the green area. And so you don't need a lot. Okay, so I told you that it costs money to do more reasonable placements of antennas, and industry doesn't like to lower its profits. So how do they pull that off? Well, you look right here. This is a captured agency, how the Federal Communication Commission is dominated by the industries it presumably regulates. Oh, is this from some conspiracy theory websites? No, it's from the Harvard University Center for Ethics. And actually, just read this too. Industry controls the FCC through a soup to nuts stranglehold that extends from its well-placed campaign spending in Congress through its control of the FCC's congressional oversight committees to its persistent agency lobbying. Yeah, it's actually a really well written paper. It's kind of like an article, and yeah, I would suggest reading it if you want to find out how the industry is able to control the FCC. This is a picture of a revolving door there because what happens, you have people from industry, the CTIA, Cellular Telecommunications Industry Association. They go from being president of that to being the head of the FCC and then vice versa. And they walk out the other side. So this is what's going on. This is how they pull it off. And your legislators are very familiar with this. That's how we learned about it. And they kind of laughed at us on the commission for being so naive as to not be aware of this. So that's part of what's going on. So the Harvard University report goes into issues like this. It talks about the details of how they're able to pull it off. And the fact that, they are so rich, they telecom are arguably the highest profit industry on this planet. So they can, kick out 100 million for, campaign contributions for lobbying and not bat an eye. And that's what they've been doing. And the article, this Harvard report, goes on to say that they're using the same playbook as industry, the tobacco industry. And they just by making false claims about there being contradiction in science. The science is conflicted. It's not conflicted. But what they're doing is they're trying through their information campaigns, their PR campaigns, they're making a lot of people think that the science is conflicted. And I'll say a little bit more about that later. Just kind of an example of this. This is, fortunately before my time, but, you have to be pretty old to remember this one. But I do remember having doctors on TV smoking and advertising for smoking. So this is the type of thing that tobacco industries did to try to keep the argument going about whether or not smoking caused cancer. And they're using the same playbook with cell phones right now. I don't know if any of you have seen the video called Thank You for Smoking, but at the end, they show how the people who were promoting tobacco now are promoting cell phones. And that's exactly what's going on. It's a PR campaign and it is working. Very quickly say some things about security because I think it's important that you know this because, like I say, the telecom will tell you that this is important for security. I've heard them say this, particularly around schools. And turns out that I've worked for the Department of Justice. And one of the things they wanted me to look at, because I was in this arena of wireless communication, what happens with cell phones during emergencies? Well, I don't think you'll be surprised to hear that in an emergency, what's the first thing people are going to do? They're going to grab their cell phone. What happens as a result of that? The towers will saturate, they don't work, so people aren't able to make their emergency calls. And now you'd say, well, maybe industry can just, build the capacity. Well, they don't do that because it costs money to build capacity, and they don't want to over-design, over-engineer because that cuts into profits. And I say this as somebody who's worked with that industry. Something else you should know about is that, oh, by the way, I've seen this personally, that cell phone towers saturating. This happened in the East Coast earthquake. And my son, who's out in California, says it happens pretty often, particularly when there's an event, even like a concert, and the cell phones just stop working. So they're not the reliable things that we are led to believe, cell phones and cell communications. Something else, and I'm getting close to the end here. Wireless networks can be jammed easier than you might think. And I'll say a bit about that in a second. For example, if you have a lot of wireless security devices in your home, or if you have any of them, so the wireless cameras and the wireless motion sensors and all that, what burglars are doing is they're going in with one of these jammers that are readily available, turning on the jammer, walking in, looting your home, and then walking out, turning off their jammer, and when you get home, you find stuff is missing, but you find no record of it and you weren't notified about it because, well, your wireless systems weren't working. So if you're going to put in security devices, don't make them wireless. And I don't need to go into this, but it's just that wireless networks are far more vulnerable to hacking than wired networks. And we can talk more about that later. I'm just going to finish this about jamming. The military is really familiar with jamming, and they use it as a tool for terrorists, for thwarting terrorist things. So if there is going to be a terrorist attack, would any knowledgeable terrorist, and they are tend to be pretty knowledgeable, would come in and jam everything before they committed the terrorist act. So it may be that people grabbing their cell phones would not only work, they wouldn't work because of saturation for the cell towers, but also because of the likelihood of jamming. And I just wanted to give this, and note that jammers aren't legal. I've had with students that wanted to build them for their senior projects, build a jammer, and then I found out what the laws were, and I just said, nah, we shouldn't, we better not go there. But just if you Google right now and put in cell phone jammers, you'll get probably the same page. There are a good number of pages of where you can buy cell phone jammers. So it's not like this is something that is in science fiction. No, it's readily available, and it's readily available today. So security issues, wireless is not the way to go. And I can say a lot more about that if people have questions. But finally, some of the conclusions. We have our final report that you can click on there. It's 390 pages, but you can get the gist of it very well in the first 20 pages or so. And then wireless radiation, which includes 5G, Wi-Fi, and other radiation sources, does pose a significant threat to human health. Electrohypersensitivity, this is kind of like what the firefighters experience. It's where, very highly sensitive. You can't function when you're exposed to any fields at all. And I have some very good and close friends who suffer from it. So it's real, and perhaps 5% of the population has electromagnetic hypersensitivity or electrohypersensitivity, and they don't even know it. And so if you find that you're having, we can talk more about that later, maybe 5% of the population, and I can give you details if you'd like it. Wireless communication isn't as secure. Well, that's important. And here's kind of a conclusion that we came up with in the commission. And that is, this is not really solely a scientific issue. No, not at all. The science is clear. Wireless radiation causes harm. We know how it causes harm. We know what diseases it causes. So this isn't a scientific issue. This is a political/economic issue. So my concluding remarks here is a formal state commission of unbiased, experts formed through bipartisan legislation concluded that low-level wireless radiation exposure is harmful to the human health and the environment, period. That's our conclusion. There's a lot that can be done. This is the good news that I talked about earlier. A lot that can be done to reduce exposures, and efforts to do so should be aggressively pursued. And we have the wherewithal to do that. So the final statement I have to make is for those of you in a position to do so are strongly encouraged to enact protections against all forms of wireless radiation. We can do it. And I'm saying this as an engineer who's been designing these systems. You locate the towers in the right places. You make modifications, lower-cost modifications to cell phones and other radiating devices. We can very much reduce people's exposures. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. And we've come to the question and answer portion of our discussion. And Dr. Chamberlain, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. There's two ways you can ask your questions this evening. If you are familiar with Zoom, you can go hit the React button, and in the React button, you'll see a place to raise your hand. Or you can physically raise your hand and we'll keep an eye out for you. You can also ask your question in the chat. If you do actually raise your hand, we will call on you and we'll highlight you. So you'll appear on the screen like I'm appearing next to Dr. Chamberlain. So please feel free. We know there was a lot of information this evening. Please feel free to ask any questions that you would like. Know that there is room and all questions belong. Also know that there may be people here that think and feel differently about cell towers, and we want to make room for that as well, and to keep our conversation respectful of all of the people who are here, understanding that there are different views. So we're just going to do our best to get you all the information you need this evening. And again, Melissa and Kelly and their team are going to continue this conversation so that you'll have many opportunities to get further informed and to continue to ask your questions. So without further ado, if you have a question for Dr. Chamberlain, please raise your hand or put it in the chat. Okay, and I'm seeing Bridget, so we'll bring Bridget up. And Bridget, you can unmute. We're going to send you an invitation to unmute. There you go.
All right. Thank you guys for being here, and Dr. Chamberlain for your presentation. So I am lucky enough to have a cell tower on our property. And I'm curious, the radiation that is emitted from that compared to, are we getting radiation from wireless routers in our houses and our cell phones and that sort of thing? And what is, I know you said this is what we need to have a 3 bars or 2 bars, that sort of thing. But from my cell phone or from that router in my house, what is the difference in that radiation?
That's a very good question. And that is one of the first things that we as the commission looked at is what are we talking about? What's wireless radiation? What's the difference between what you get from your router and what you get from a cell tower or your cell phone? Turns out they're very similar. In fact, the signal that you get from your cell phone is identical, pretty much identical to what you get from a cell tower. You get radiation from, radiation from all of the wireless devices in your house. And so one thing I recommend is that we make available a meter to everyone. You can do this through the library. With the Environmental Health Trust, we have a program that allows libraries to buy these meters cheaper. And that's probably the best way. Because the reason I say that have a meter is that you have devices in your home, probably, that radiate and you don't even know about it. I remember one colleague had purchased a new stove, and all of a sudden they found that they had high radiation in their home, in their kitchen in particular. Well, it was because the devices radiate. So that would be my number one suggestion, but there are some really common sense things people can do. For example, locate the router in a place that's far away from people, where people hang out, and particularly where people sleep. That's what we've done here. I have wireless, a Wi-Fi, and we have it in the basement, in the corner. It works great in our house, but the levels from it are very low. So I'm not sure I answered your question thoroughly, or maybe didn't answer at all. But do you want to follow on with that?
So see if I can get a meter from the library to see. What can we do about it? So what can we do? So these meters, these towers, so it's my understanding that Eversource owns them. I've been kind of informed that the city doesn't have any say over it anymore, and that it's at the state level. They've made the recommendation is there, but so now what? What can we do as residents in Ward 1 and 2 and parents at St. Catherine's and to prevent these from popping up and get it out of my yard?
So we do have lawyers that can answer, questions. I'm not a lawyer, but I have seen people that, have been able to put ordinances in place. In fact, even in Bedford, they have some pretty good ordinances, your neighbor in Bedford. And so it's just taking people getting active as you are, and as this event tonight shows, because I'm backing off a little bit and saying that we've had very poor luck in implementing the recommendations of the New Hampshire Commission at the federal level and at the state level. And this implies a type of corruption, which I think we all know exists, that industry, because of their wealth, is able to persuade or to keep meaningful legislation from getting passed. But where we have had good luck is at the grassroots level with people like you and Melissa. So if you can make a big enough fuss about this, things tend to happen. And you can get ordinances put in place. And over time, by putting constant pressure on the powers that be, things can happen. Pam, I don't know if you want to add to this, but you and I have both seen these, and we've seen cases where parents have gotten up in arms because they've heard the information from tonight, and so they won't accept some of the BS answers that they're getting from school administrators and from industry. And I don't know if you want to tell the story or if I should tell it, what happened in Wyandotte at the school board meeting.
Would you like to tell it?
Well, it's a good story, so sure. So just parents went and they went to the school board meeting and they were getting these a line of BS. In other words, oh yeah, the towers are compliant with FCC standards, so there's nothing we can do about it, which is not true. Are we living in a place where we're told that something that negatively affects our health and the health of our children, that we can't do anything about it? Is that where we've ended up? And so if people won't take it, won't accept it, then things will change. So what happened in Wyandotte is people went, and they were being told this BS. And so they rose up, they had to bring the police in to a school board meeting. But in the final analysis, the superintendent of schools ended up resigning, i.e. was fired, because they wouldn't do anything to help. And now they have a new superintendent who's working with them to get the towers removed from their school. It's not a dissimilar case. There are things that can be done. But it's not going to be easy. But it is important. Pam, I'm sorry, I gave you the opportunity to follow up and I talked on.
No, that's okay. I just want to say a couple things. Bridget, about your first question, the difference between having your devices in your home and having a cell tower outside of your home is that you can turn on and off your devices. You can control the level of exposures in your house. There's also things you can do to mitigate. There are people called building biologists sometimes they're all over the country that can come in and measure and give you a profile of what's going on in your house. So that's huge. With a cell tower, you don't have that level of control. And so that's what we see, the significant difference. The other thing, I'm putting a model ordinance from Ithaca, New York. It's considered one of the best in the country. And I just put it in the chat. So you can take a look at what they're doing. And these ordinances are popping up all over the country. Also, schools and counties and states are putting in their own provisions. A very popular one is a 1,500-foot setback from any school or school grounds, because the industry right now has been siting a lot of towers or attempting at schools, and parents like yourselves are very understandably concerned about this because children are most vulnerable. So we can talk more about specific things you can do, again, in your own home. The Environmental Health Trust, and I'll find their information, has some wonderful suggestions for how you can be tech safe at home, how we can be tech safe at school. One of our colleagues is a guy named Frank Clegg, and he's the former president of Microsoft Canada. And he actually goes into schools in Canada and he's helped them reduce their exposures by 90% while still enjoying full-bodied, robust signals and 21st century tech learning. So there's lots of things that can be done, and we do partner with schools in helping them to take those steps. Again, the schools are just finding this information out as well. It's a big shock to everyone. So we do have to have a little bit of patience with that. The good news is that there are definitely things that we can do, and that's the work that we do, is to point to a safer future with our technology.
Thank you, Pam. Just real quickly, I'll put this slide up. And this is just a sampling of examples of where good, reasonable setbacks have been put in place by other municipalities. So it's not like you can't do it. You can. It just takes the will to do it. And sometimes municipal administrators will say, oh, our hands are tied, we can't do anything. And that's just not true. There's a lot that can be done. By the way, the slide that I just put up is linked, or it's included in the slides in the appendix. And so you can click on those links to find out what's going on in those particular municipalities.
Thank you. Bridget, anything else? Oops, just got taken off. Does anybody else have a question this evening? You can go to the React button and raise your hand, or physically raise your hand, or put your question in the chat. Okay. And Melissa or Kelly, you've been speaking to a lot of parents over the course of the last few weeks, and I know there are a number of people that aren't able to be here tonight because there was the unfortunate passing of a child and they're at the wake. Do you guys want to share a little bit of the questions that you've been hearing so that you can put them forth to the community? Because we know that one person's question tends to be everybody's question. So if you have any questions that you can share, that would be wonderful. And if any of our audience, again, has a question, feel free to break in, to raise your hand. We'll spotlight you. Okay, thanks.
I just wanted to, again, thank Dr. Chamberlain. Thank you so much. And I wanted to thank everyone who was able to join us here tonight. It is unfortunate that a few parents weren't able to. I believe it has been covered a little bit, but just in case, understanding that there is a concern with having it outside of the school, how far back from the school would you recommend, Dr. Chamberlain, would be a safer distance for our kids?
Well, it's mentioned, the New Hampshire Commission came up with 500 meters, and that may not be necessary for a booster compared to a regular macro tower. And so it does boil down to, and some municipalities are starting to look in at coming up with regulations in terms of signal level as opposed to distance. So at what point would I feel comfortable with radiation exposure? Perhaps a distance where the signal level went below 100 microvolts per meter or microwatts per meter squared. I'm a little bit reluctant to make that as a firm statement, because when I do make that, then there are people in the electrosensitive community who say, no, that's not sufficiently low. But I do think that there are ways that we can come up with exposure levels that are enforceable, that provide the type of protection that you don't have currently. I mean, 80,000 microwatts per meter squared is not sufficiently low. I can say that that's not sufficient. So how far back would you have to go? We'd have to do tests. I mean, I haven't looked at that particular antenna specifically, but we could come up with distances. We could come up with designs that would be reasonable in terms of not overly exposing people waiting in line or the students who are out on the practice field. And that's not going to happen when you have the antenna right there.
And so, remembering one of the slides that you had, just in case there were any skeptics among us who saw the slide with the tree right outside of the cell tower over time.
Yeah.
Understanding that our children are not planted in place over years, right? That they're on the school grounds for 7 or 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. Would those safety concerns still apply here, given the differences?
Well, going back to that slide, because I like this one myself, look at the levels that we're talking about. And remember that what you measured was over 80,000 microwatts per meter squared. And this exposure here was 3,000. So what we do know about radiation exposure is that it's cumulative. So this tree that's in relatively low exposure, that's fixed in place, but it's getting this constant barrage of electromagnetic energy. Over time, it wears on it. If you have a student that's out in a playground, and it's either your student is getting exposed to 80,000 microwatts per meter squared, substantially higher than what's shown right here, it's going to have a substantially greater impact than what you're seeing on this tree. So you need to take that into consideration when you're coming up with levels that are okay, or reasonable is the term that I prefer to use.
So fair to say you'd still have safety concerns for kids at that level?
With the level that it is right now, absolutely. Yeah. I definitely would have concerns.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure. And I know that we've been at this for over an hour now, and it's a Monday night, and I really appreciate everyone's time. I do see one other question where in the group chat, so I'm just going to take it, and it asks whether or not we know what St. Catherine's position is on this matter. I would just defer back to the most recent letter that was sent out to the St. Catherine's community that indicated that my takeaway from the letter was that they were in favor of removal. So the goal of tonight was really just to bring neighbors and parents together to focus on learning more about these towers. I'm new to this topic, very new to this topic. So I really appreciate hearing from Dr. Chamberlain. I'm gonna anxiously wait to hear more from St. Catherine's when they're ready to approach it. And we would just encourage anyone else who is also interested in keeping apprised of information in the community, whether you're involved in St. Catharines or just a resident of Ward 1 or Ward 2, want to keep learning more about these cell phone towers and whether or not you're interested in joining our efforts. The Facebook page is in the chat. Please join us. We are working to take certain actions, and we'd love any support that we can get, because right now there's a lot on Melissa's plate. I'm doing what I can to help, and obviously Dr. Chamberlain has been donating his time along with Pam and Stacy. So strength in numbers. So look forward to hearing from individuals who are willing to join our efforts. And again, I really want to thank everyone who joined us this evening, especially Alderman Goonan, and I don't know if Alderman Morgan made it. I know that there were a lot of last minute things that came up, and it's a Monday night, so thank you.
And I'm going to bust in because we do have 2 questions. David, I saw your hand up. Would you still like to speak? We'll let David, we're going to unmute David, and then right after David, John. I did want to say something real quick. When we're talking about the cell tower, again, exposures and standing place, one of the things we have to realize is the exposures are cumulative. And you have to think about how many devices and how much wireless radiation your child or you are exposed to every single day. So that is something that we do need to keep in mind, because when we think about safety, a lot of times those numbers are not getting added together. You're looking at the individual effects of your router or your cell phone or the tower, but not the cumulative effects of all 3. Okay, and here we go, David.
Hi, I'm Dave. I'm the superintendent of schools for our diocese, and I'm also a parent. I have a son at St. Catharines as well. So I just had a couple of questions. So you'd mentioned in the presentation when you showed the handheld tester, and you said that when you're talking about the tree and how the numbers in the parking lot are much higher than even this number that's hitting the tree. Like, how do we know that? How do we know what the numbers actually are on the playground where the kids are playing or in the building?
Well, it's a great question, and you need to, get access to one of these meters. The one that was shown is a calibrated meter, and so the one reason I like that meter, it's a broadband meter, and you simply hold it, turn it on, and it gives you numbers that are meaningful. And I'd have to a little bit of training to use it. But if you go into the classroom, and I'm really hoping, and I've worked with schools that do this, that you have the Wi-Fi running and you go into classrooms, for example, and see where the hotspots are. And so this is really important, because you don't want a student sitting under a router, because you can get very high amounts of radiation there. And so, but there's some things you can do, pretty easy things, is remove the router, put it in the hallway where students don't get a lot of exposure, and just make sure that nobody sits directly underneath it. Right. And so having a meter is very helpful, but as Pam pointed out earlier, there are people that can come up and do an assessment. And very similar to what Frank Clegg, from Microsoft is doing in Canada. There are
routers. You recommend like a third-party assessment?
Yes. Yeah, and we can talk more about this later.
Because you said something about how, you weren't quite sure the difference between the booster and the actual towers and the distance that they might need to be. So for us, it makes sense to just figure out exactly what's happening on the campus in terms of where the hotspots are, what the readings are, and then, where do they compare to those levels that you talked about?
Yeah, the reason that I shied away from making a pronouncement about boosters is I installed one in my brother's home. He has an off-grid cabin away from things, and he wanted to have cell reception, and it wasn't available there, but I put in a booster. I can tell you how it works later, but the bottom line is he got great coverage in his house with very low exposure levels. Yeah. So if done correctly, you don't have to have the high exposure levels with a booster.
There's a lot of those boosters in that neighborhood too. So now that it's kind of brought to our attention, we're looking around, there's quite a few of them.
Yeah. And because that's
all throughout the neighborhood. And I don't know if they connect and go from, one to another, or they're there strategically, or it's just random. But it's kind of interesting, even moving it how far back, there's going to be another one right nearby. So we're kind of trying to figure out where all those are and just try to make sense of it all.
Well, yeah, I know. And because sometimes, people get just deluged with information, kind of like what's happening tonight. And, how do you make sense of this and what's important? And what is the benefit we're reaping from exposing our kids to radiation? Is there a way that we can lower that exposure? And the answer is definitely yes. And what I sometimes get brought in as an engineer is to look at these sites and say, okay, well, how can we locate things so that we can still get the coverage we want without getting the overexposure that we don't want?
Agreed. Yeah, I don't think you're going to get any argument from us or anyone that exposure or high exposure is bad for your health. I mean, we all see that. It's just trying to make, and it's a Catholic school, so it's not a city school, and it's more. I think it's a good question. Like, let's just say the readings are high, and we want it moved, and we definitely just first off wanted it moved and asked for it to be moved, and got the straight arm no. But this is going to be local city thing that we're going to have to talk to folks about and see where we go. But there's not we can want it moved, but unless the city government is in favor and some of these ordinances and other things, it's going to be tricky.
It definitely can be tricky. And that's why I'm saying it needs to be a grassroots movement. But if I were a parent of a kid in your school, one of your schools, which my kids are older now, I would just scream bloody murder for however long it took, because we're seeing the increase in rates of many of these very harmful things like diabetes and cancer. And I continue to hear these stories, and I suspect, or I feel very confident that they're related to high exposures to these fields. So just to make a stink, because that's what tends to make things happen in politics.
Yeah, and a lot of our families too are from they're not from the town the school is in.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got people not living in the town where the lobbying is taking place. So we have to think about all that. But but thank you. It was a good presentation, and I really especially liked even regardless of boosters, taking a look in the buildings, what the kids are exposed to just from the different devices and everything else that are there.
Well, yeah, and feel free to call on me. I'd be glad to meet with you, or do whatever I can to help you in your mission to protect your kids.
Yeah, and we definitely are meeting. We've been having multiple meetings and getting together, and what's the next course of action as well. So, including Katie and Father Chris and diocesan folks. So, we're certainly not poo-pooing it. We're definitely, just trying to figure it out.
Right. There's another expert on the line, Marianne Tierney, who has a potential response to something you asked earlier. Marianne, do you want to come on board?
Give us just a minute. We're finding Marianne.
Okay, there she is. Who's in North Carolina, by the way, and is dealing with the aftermath of a hurricane.
Wow.
Are you running on generator now, Marianne?
A little weird tonight while I'm working on a generator. But I will share that I've worked with a number of schools. I went to St. Catherine's School myself in Ringwood, New Jersey. I was raised in Catholic schools, and I'm now a building biologist. I certified by the Building Biology Institute as an electromagnetic radiation specialist. And when we're dealing with this kind of thing on the ground, we often, when we're trying to get a baseline to be able to report to parents, to be able to report to the wireless industry or the school administration, one of the easiest ways to really figure out the baseline is to have after school hours is to shut down all of the wireless devices. So if it's centrally controlled, turning all of those off with your IT support, or going around and manually unplugging all those devices, making sure that all the teachers' laptops or PCs are turned off. So everything is turned off. And then be able to take those measurements. And I know that there is some access for you all, or I think there is, to the Safe and Sound Pro 2, which is the meter that has been lent out to some libraries. And when you're using that, it's important to run it in a figure 8 kind of sweeping motion. And what you're looking at is the peak, which is the top number, and the max. And we ignore the average. It's like taking the Berkshire Mountains and stretching them out and calling the region flat, right? That's what the FCC uses. We don't use the average, but we use the peak, and we use the max is essentially what is the highest reading since the meter was turned on. The other thing that we're increasingly seeing is that a lot of these small cells and towers have frequencies that are above 6 gigahertz, which is as high as, or 8 gigahertz is the highest that the Safe and Sound Pro 2 will go. And so there's another meter out now called the a millimeter wave meter from Safe Living Technologies. And what I sometimes see is that we'll get lower readings on one meter and higher readings on the other, but millimeter waves are in the 40. The meter picks up from 20 to 40 gigahertz, and those are extremely dangerous as well.
So, really the conclusion is that we have protocols in place and we have equipment available that really can answer the questions about what your students are getting exposed to. Students and staff, I absolutely don't want to exclude your faculty. So yeah, a lot of things that can be done. And if people have questions, I can either direct them to you, Marianne, or we can get them the information through other means. So thank you for your input.
And I did want to say there's 2 more questions. And David and Katie, I know you're on the call. Kent can make himself, like he said, available to you. In addition to his information, we do work with the leading telecommunications expert attorneys in the country. And so a lot of the things that you're being told, no, there's nothing you can do. Well, that's their first line of defense, obviously. They really don't want to move the cell phone tower. But there are certainly things that you can do, and there's information that we can provide so that you can see some of the gateways that might help you address this situation. So please be in touch if you can, if that's something of interest. So we have 2 more questions. First, John, did you still want to ask a question? Okay, we're going to highlight John, and then after John, there's another question from the chat.
John.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your presentation, Dr. Chamberlain. And I did miss half of it, so I'm going to apologize if you did give this information. But I'm just wondering where you said there was a library that can loan out one of those meters. And if that was correct, where can I go to get one of those meters to test my house?
So we have a program through the Environmental Health Trust that does make meters available to libraries at a lower cost. And so you might want to contact your library and ask them if they would be willing in participating in a program like that. And you can put them in touch with me, and I'll get the information they need, because libraries are known for getting things, making things available that are sometimes relatively expensive. The meter itself, I forget what the price is right now, but it's in the $300, $400 area. Some people just say, I want to have my own meter, but if you want to get it through a library, we can help the library and help offset some of the cost.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for your question.
Could I actually ask someone something quickly?
Yeah, of course.
Sorry. So what is the ultimate goal? Like to completely remove them, or is it like, can they be farther a little bit? Would that be like safe enough? Or
well, the answer is yes. That I don't know if you were here when I was giving the slide on how much of a signal you need. You don't need a strong signal. It can be very weak, which means the tower can be very far away. So you can still enjoy a very good, robust phone call, download your data, watch things on YouTube, and not be overly exposed, still be in the green level on that meter. meaning, you know, their
Yes.
levels are low. It just costs the telecom companies a lot less to put them, the antennas right there on top of you than it does to
Yeah.
put them in a more remote location where your signal exposure would be lower. So yeah, move them away, put them
Move
in
them
places,
away.
or
Okay.
you could even potentially, and I don't mean to complicate the issue, but you could put in a lot more antennas, each of them radiating a lot lower signal, and you'd achieve basically the same thing. There are lots and lots of solutions that would achieve lower exposures while still giving you the connectivity that you want.
Thank you.
All right, and we have one more question. It said, where did the numbers come from on the playground? Was this actually measured at an extreme level? And Melissa, do you want to answer that question? And talk about your measurements.
Yeah, sure. So Kent showed me how to use the meter and allowed me to borrow it. So for a period of a couple weeks, actually, I took readings at different times in different locations around the playground, around the neighborhood. I even took some at it was John's house one evening outside in front of his. And so I sent all of those to Kent to take a look at, you know, and he reviewed them. So, and I'm happy to, you know, I still have the meter. He's still letting me borrow it. When he says I have to give it back, I will. But I'm happy to meet Bridget as well, or anyone else that wants to check theirs.
And that sounds like quite an offer you're making, Melissa. So take advantage of that. So as long as she has the meter, and go into your homes. You know, have, as things are set up right now, just go in, put the meter on your pillow, on your kids' pillows, and see what you read. It should be in the green, because this is particularly important in the time when people rest, you know, when you're asleep, because electromagnetic waves can interfere with your sleep. It impacts the melatonin. Oh, and something else that I really should say, and that is, you kind of assume when you have your phone just sitting there, as mine's sitting here right now, that it's not doing anything. Oh, it's not, you know, it's not radiating. I'm not on a phone call or anything. It turns out that your phone is almost constantly talking to the local cell tower. It's called handshake. And so even though your phone's not turned off, or I mean, you have it, you're not using it for a phone call, it's radiating. So if it sits on your nightstand, that's where I always kept mine. Probably most of you keep yours there. It's radiating, and it can impact your sleep, and it will impact your health over time. So what you might want to do is put it in airplane mode. If you have a call, you know, you need to be ready for a call, move it away, put it on your dresser that's farther away from your head. So things like that can make a big difference. So test your phone, you know, test the signal level at various places in your home, and also play around with it. Take your phone that's not doing anything, put the meter next to it, and you'll see what I'm talking about.
And I think we have a question, Dave, I don't know if you can answer. One of the parents asked, would the school share this information with the school community? And we are recording this evening's presentation. You certainly can, but I feel you're best to answer that question.
Sorry, I was on mute. What would I be sharing if we had a third party test the campus, the results?
I think they're asking about the presentation and the information they're getting tonight. Can Jay Donovan, can you quantify that in the chat for us? Let's make sure. Or you can come on, let's have him answer that. If you can bring Jay on.
I don't know.
Give us just a minute and we'll bring Jay on too. There you go, Jay. You're on.
No, thank you. And thank you, Dr. Chamberlain, for the wonderful presentation. I say thank you to everyone here tonight, as well as Katie and Dave. I guess my question is, I know that you promote the theme of in partnership, right, with the parents, and based on the communication that we received from St. Catherine's on what is being conducted and what the steps are in the evaluation of this this tower being located on campus. Obviously, there's other information that should be shared with the parents, right? So my question to you, Dave, is will you be sharing this information with the school community in order for, again, changes hopefully to be made, and in order to get this type of movement, in order to again, move this initiative forward. So just looking for your thoughts. I know you meet with internal people at the same time, based on the levels that you can see and that your child attends St. Catherine's, you can see that the levels are so extreme that, we've waited, X amount of months to have this addressed. I just want to see what your thoughts were going forward.
Yeah, and I don't know if the device that the school was using is different, and I don't know those numbers off the top of my head. Those weren't extreme numbers in the parking lot or in the building. So all I can tell you is we need to look at it all again. I think our next step was going to be bringing someone in to test the site, get that done inside and outside the building, and then we'll go from there in terms of we're happy to share, what we've been talking about and, the process that we're taking. Absolutely.
Okay, and Kelly is raising her hand. Is this question for Dave? And Dave, will be respectful. We understand you were not at all planning to be a person on.
That's fine. I know I'm being recorded. No, I'm kidding.
Thank you.
You want Kelly?
No, actually, thank you for unmuting. I actually just was asking to be unmuted because in all fairness, tonight's meeting was really just to bring in neighbors and parents alike, and to get everyone on the same page. I know people have questions specific to St. Catherine's, but I didn't want to, lose too much focus on what the collective sort of goals were, which was to make sure that, because everyone's coming in from different levels. So again, just to sort of recap, I really want to thank the fact that Dave, you're here, and that Katie is here. Give them a chance to respond when they're able to do so. But we have other residents here outside of St. Catherine's, focusing on the goals here of getting Dr. Chamberlain's information out to the collective, getting everyone on the same page, and encouraging people to join the Facebook group so that we could figure out how to move forward. And so I just really wanted to appreciate that, everyone, for being here and kind of get Dave out of the hot seat there for a second.
Fair enough. We have one more question from Bridget. And parents, yes, David and Katie are aware of this, as is Father Chris, so there will be plenty of time to ask questions. Thank you for bringing it up, and David, thank you for being such a good sport. And then I believe Bridget is our last question for the evening.
Yeah, but I just wanted to follow up as a resident in the neighborhood with Dave. You had mentioned, Dave, the cell towers, the small towers kind of throughout the neighborhood. Like I had said earlier, there's one right in my front yard. And to be honest, I didn't even know it was there till it was brought to my attention. There was a picture on the Facebook page and I was like, oh, salmon and hemlock, that's me. And in talking to next door neighbors and people throughout the neighborhood, we're not even realizing that that's what is there. There are warnings on these, but they're far above eye level. So, Dave, I think that there are definitely people in the neighborhood that would, I think we'd all love to work together to make this all a safer situation for all of us.
Thank you, Bridget. And I think I'm going to say just a couple things, and we're going to let Melissa and Kelly bring it to a close. We do have the parent Facebook page. That's the best way to get in touch with Kelly and Melissa and to talk about next steps. Also, I did put the Environmental Health Trust's link in for safe tips at home, and Mary Ann put in about what they cost. The meters, it says Safe and Sound Pro, is about $400. So anyway, that information is there for you. Please connect with these guys on Facebook so you guys can again come together as a community and talk about your next best steps. And so Melissa and Kelly, will hand it to you.
Again, I just want to thank everyone for being here. I also want to acknowledge again that Alderman Gooden is here. Again, I don't see Alderman Morgan. He's actually my alderman for Ward 1. I know Kelly's also in Ward 1. There's plenty of us that are in Ward 1. We are also concerned because there are some small cells even coming up further on Webster into our neighborhood. So we know that that's the next move. So we're hoping that we can connect with them after this. And with all the other parents, I can tell you, I've had so many parents messaging me while we've been on here privately. Some don't want to ask their questions right now. They're digesting. I also have some that couldn't make it this evening that are asking me questions. So I also asked that maybe we can consider having a meeting, maybe for the school community as well, where maybe some more of our questions can be answered. That might be something to think about. And I do want to just throw out there again, if you can let Kelly and I know what your thoughts are, we appreciate that. And we will set up a time for us to discuss action steps to take this further. And please let us know how you would like to help, because we could really appreciate the help. This does take up a lot of time. I can tell you it has become my full-time job. And we could really use the help. And I think there's a lot of people in our community that do care and that are willing to make noise and do whatever we can to make sure our families are safe. So thank you.
Kelly, any closing comments? Nope. Dr. Chamberlain, any closing comments? Nope. Oops, for some reason, we don't have your voice. There we go.
Kind of an on-off switch. Have that figured out by now. So anyhow, I just wanted to thank you all for your attention and for your questions. And Melissa and Kelly, and thank you for arranging this. It's an important message, and it's just not getting out to the right people at this time, except for efforts like what you're doing here. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you all for coming this evening. And Kelly and Melissa will let you know if there's another event of this nature, or we'll talk about when there's a time where you can come together as a community to address these questions and your concerns. So thank you all for coming. Good night.
Good night.